Cool. So thanks for the intro. It was really amazing. And it's awesome to be here. And also for all the folks that are online. Yeah, so the Comrades was an interesting story. I was doing endurance events in the US with a bunch of friends. You'll tell from the accent, that's where I grew up. So I had lived in New York for about 20 years at the time. And somebody had the great idea, like, hey, we've done Ironman, we've done a bunch of things. Let's go to South Africa. They've got this famous marathon. And all I heard was South Africa marathon sounds great. I'm going to go, and that should be relatively straightforward. So boom, sign up really without doing the due diligence on the event. And only to learn that in South Africa, what we call in the US, what a marathon is like a 42K thing, right? In South Africa, it's 89 Ks, all uphill from Durban to Pietermaritzburg. So it was a very long day of suffering. But yes, I did complete it, and it really is I guess, a metaphor for the startup experience, right? Which is, it's incredible suffering. You do a lot of prep. It's not really fun on the day or while you're in it, but afterwards, you can always look back and say, regardless of the outcome, that it was an extraordinary experience. So, yeah, a little bit about me. Where's Vincent? Sorry, I've lost him in the room. But talking about the online grocery business, so he built his online grocery business in 2016. He started, with bottles. My first startup was in 1996. Was an online grocery business. But whereas he had Uber and WhatsApp and functioning internet, we had dial-up modems. So my story doesn't go nearly as well as his did, but we did spend 2 years slaving away trying to find a product market fit. Built a really cool product, but again, at the time, we were confronted with far too many challenges. So really that brings me to, my long career was in startups, it was in venture capital. I was involved in other successful startups at the height of the dot-com boom in the 1990s in New York, which at the time was called Silicon Alley. So it was really like the first emerging market outside of Silicon Valley. And then after the dot-com boom became the bust and collapsed, took a sabbatical for a bit and ended up with a friend of mine starting a US-India fund that very fortuitously we got rolled up into SoftBank, which is now, of course, at that time it was a much smaller fund, now is it is the biggest venture fund in the world. So between 2006 2011, we were running, or part of that SoftBank fund, a China-India fund. So again, kind of the emerging economy story, we were at the forefront of that. And then coming up in 2011, said, great, what am I going to do next? Randomly had come down to South Africa, suffered a lot, on the plains of Umhlanga, and went down to Cape Town afterwards to drink some wine, and stumbled on this kind of very nascent tech scene. And having seen this at the time, I'd seen this movie twice before and said, look, we know where this is going, and Africa is now going to be the next big emerging economy. So let's come to Africa and we'll help set up a fund here. But for many reasons, which we all are still suffering with today, venture funding in Africa is hard. And what we recognized was at the time that what startups really needed was a way to become more fundable, and how to tell their stories better, how to validate their experience, what they're achieving better, and how to connect with investors, but also education on the other side for investors, how to get involved with Africa. So as you'll see here, the numbers are pretty drastic. The US last year did $132 billion worth of venture funding, and the South Africans did not all of Africa, we did 1.4 billion. Okay. That icon doesn't necessarily represent one particular place, just the size of how it shows up. But it's really an anomaly, because what this represents is a current market view. And we know this story, and there's nothing particularly shocking about this. However, where the inspiration for us comes is when you start to look at the demographics of where things are going. So I'm going to provide just a couple of quick stats for you, and then we're going to dive back into more of the detail about why we think the future is so different than where the present is. Okay? So just very quickly run through. So by the way, this study that these data points are pulled from is from Africa Arena has the full study. So you're welcome to take pictures of the slides, but you can also download the full. Christoph, where do we get the actual report? AfricaArena.com. Okay, so very, very easy, just right on the site. So so I'm going to talk through the trends. You can go there. There's a 80-something page report that goes through a lot more detail. So we know that the top 4 jurisdictions and countries, Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and South Africa. Ghana is starting to make its ascension, but basically whether you're looking at number of deals or volume of deals, that's where that's where you're going to fall out. Those are the geographies to be in. Very quickly on some of the kind of key differentiations. So starting with Nigeria. What you find there is there's just an incredible emphasis on hustle. So the Nigerian entrepreneurs are like nowhere else on the continent, sometimes to a fault, but they're fantastic at promotion, and as a result, they do particularly well in accelerators like Y Combinator in Silicon Valley because it's all about bravado, it's all about self-confidence, and Nigerians are fantastic at that. There's also been some of the top fundraising stories, some of the most exciting ones that have come out of there. But the thing that we're also seeing is there's just an incredible amount of startups, just at the very, very small level. So I'm going to get into, from a Startup Bootcamp perspective, where we're seeing applications, but Nigerian, of course, is far above and beyond. Egypt, technically it is in Africa. It's very much a kind of hybrid model with Middle East, and so you see some really extraordinary models coming out of there as well. Kenya, of course, East Africa, one of the greatest things going for it is they had the foundation of mobile money, M-Pesa, and there's just a ton of derivatives that have come out of that as a result. And finally, we get to South Africa, where we're all sitting here. We have some of the best universities on the continent, and we also have one of the best business banking infrastructures. And so from an investment perspective, there's a tremendous amount of confidence with investors putting money into this economy. So I want to jump real quick to kind of from a GDP perspective, because this is really interesting that when you think about the amount of VC, obviously countries like the US and European countries have a high GDP, but you see the difference between North America and Europe in terms of how much of that ends up in VC investing. Whereas far on the left is all the African countries, very small GDP, but Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, South Africa, all are above the trend line, but of course, not surprisingly, Kenya is actually far about. It's high, it's very high outperforming. So the startups, again, if you look at a 5-year trend, we know they're very exciting. South Africa, interestingly enough, has the greatest number of early stage deals. So even though when you look at later stage funding or total number of deals, South Africa is usually 2 or 3 or 4 on the list. In terms of early stage deals, they're at the forefront. And that means we're part of the funnel. So this is now switching a bit into, from a South African perspective, from a Startup Bootcamp perspective, what we do is we go out and we are the feeder really for this whole venture capital scene. So we find startups that are still at the very early stage. Usually they certainly have traction, but they usually have not yet raised a round, or they've maybe just raised some angel funding. And we run a Pan-African program that scouts for all of these teams. So this year we've just completed, as of last Friday, our scouting. And we received 2,200 applications for 10 spots to get into this program. So 2,200 applications from all across, from actually I think 79 countries we had applications from. And the interesting trends are that when you start to look at where all those applications are coming from, in the past, the first 3 years we ran the program, not sub-Saharan Africa, but Southern Africa was really running on parity. We're now seeing that West Africa has like completely blown us out of the water, right? So when you look at the top 10 countries, it used to be, South Africa was a quarter of the applications, Kenya might be 20%, Nigeria was always first, but now Nigerian startups are nearly half of all we're seeing. Part of this is as a result of the stage. So when we're now starting to trend more towards growth stage. Still startup, which basically these definitions, the startup stages mean that there is some traction, but not necessarily revenue, but they have customers, they have product in the market. But nearly a third of our startups now that are applying for these programs are all post-revenue startups, right? So these are companies, so we're seeing a more and more trend towards startups that are able to apply to us and benefit from what this program offers. Interestingly enough, this year, agri-tech has completely dominated the applications. So we see that really as a result, and these are broad categories, but a lot of food security, supply chain, logistics, alternative foods, these are things that, are starting to become a significant reality in Africa. So not promoting SBC, but really just the broader ecosystem approach that accelerators like us and programs like us, what we do is we bring together all of the key stakeholders and players. And the earlier conversations around exits, a lot of it related to corporates. And for better, for worse, that will continue to be the case in the African ecosystem for a long time. So whereas there are a few high-flying examples of B2C startups raising a ton of capital and being very successful in scaling, the vast majority of the startups that are doing particularly well are B2B or they are B2B2C, which means they're leveraging corporate relationships in order to access route to market. So they're not having to go out and spend money to gain consumers themselves, they're able to leverage. So Bottles didn't have to go out and scoop up a whole mass market because Pick and Pay was happy to help promote them for, as an example. And we have some really fascinating ones as well. So the reason that kind of mindset shifts, the earlier speakers were talking about this corporate, is that there's this really, there's kind of an internal or the closed innovation versus open innovation. And on the open innovation approach, what it means is that corporates have to be comfortable, corporates and partners, have to be comfortable with this idea that they're investing into startups, or they're investing time and resources, not necessarily money, time and resources in which the benefit of that may not be themselves. So we've had startups where the corporates are happy to say, look, we hope we benefit, and we may be a primary beneficiary, but this startup is not going to be locked in. And as a result of that ecosystem, the tech ecosystem, the open ecosystem, it's the rising tide raises all ships. So lots of corporates have come on board with programs like ours. You'll recognize a number of South African-based entities here. And in the new program that we're running, Telecel, which is a mobile operator, is really able to bring that to the forefront. And I think testament to them that this 2,200 applications is both a representation of what we're the times that we're living in, and the resources and the opportunities that are available. More and more people are being forced into entrepreneurship because they don't necessarily have corporate jobs, they don't have readily available income, but it also represents that this is the greatest period of opportunity. And so I always like to kind of highlight this at the end with, we live in South Africa where we're just, not too far from the cradle of humanity. And so if you think back, millions of years, the first 2 million years or so of our collective history, all the innovation in the world, all the disruptive tech in the world was all right here, right? This is where it all started. And this is where it stayed for a long time. And if you look at, in geologic terms, it's really been just like 10,000 years, a blip where that innovation, that centers of innovation went to Europe, and then they went to Silicon Valley. But now, if you think about the demographic trends, okay, between now and the end of this century, they're projected to be about 4 billion more people coming on the planet, okay? And 90% of all of that growth is happening in Africa. So by the end of this century, Africa will be the most populous continent on the planet. And if you look at the top, and there's also this trend with urban growth. So out of the top 20 cities globally, by the end of this century, 13 of those cities are going to be African cities, okay? And the top 3 cities will be African cities, but these are cities that most people in the world, and even many people in Africa, wouldn't be able to put on a map today. So Lagos is a pretty obvious one, but most people would never imagine that Dar es Salaam, right, is going to be the second most populous city in the planet. So all of that growth is obviously absurd. We live in an African city. We know, you try to imagine traffic today, and then you double or triple or quadruple the population, right? Dar es Salaam is going to be an 8x population of where it's at today. That growth is impossible with any known techniques, technologies, services, solutions that we have available to us. So all of the things that are going to make life possible, that are going to make just daily life possible, are going to be new inventions and new interpretations and new creations and new adaptations. And the question is, who's going to be making those adaptations? Who's going to be coming up with the disruptive tech to solve the problems that we in Africa are facing every single day? It's not going to be someone in Silicon Valley. It's not going to be someone in the UK. It's not going to be someone even in China. It's going to be people sitting in Africa dealing with that every single day. So it is the cradle of humanity, but we refer to this as the cradle of disruption. And this is why we are so optimistic about what the next generation, the next century looks like for Africa. And hence, everyone in here that's part of this ecosystem of innovation and disruption is part of building that just unbelievable future. So thank you very much, and looking forward to taking questions.
Thank you very much.